At 9:17 a.m. on January 22nd, 1943, a young American officer lay pressed into the damp floor of a shattered Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. Second Lieutenant John George, 27 years old, Illinois state rifle champion, 0 confirmed kills, was staring through a scope his fellow officers had been laughing at for a month and a half. 240 yards in front of him, a banyan tree rose out of the jungle, its trunk as thick as a small car, its branches disappearing into a canopy of shadow. Somewhere up there, hidden in that maze of roots and leaves, the men who were killing his friends were waiting. For 6 weeks, the 132nd Infantry Regiment had listened to the crack of invisible rifles in the groves around Point Cruz. For 3 days, those rifles had drawn blood non-stop. 14 Americans had died in 72 hours. Intelligence estimated 11 Japanese snipers operating in the groves. And now, one stubborn lieutenant with a rifle, everyone in his unit thought was a joke, lay alone in a ruined bunker, waiting to see if he could stop them. It was not a standard issue M1 Garand. It was not a Springfield. It was a Winchester Model 70 with a civilian Lyman Alaskan scope, bought with 2 years of National Guard pay and delivered in a wooden shipping crate. The battalion commander had called it a toy. Other platoon leaders had nicknamed it his mail-order sweetheart. Now the toy and the sweetheart were all that stood between those 11 snipers and the rest of the 132nd. 6 months earlier, none of this existed for George. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, he had opened that wooden crate like a kid on Christmas morning. Inside lay the rifle he had dreamed about since high school, a slender 9-pound bolt-action Winchester. The Lyman scope sat on top in a Griffin and Howe mount, a setup normally seen in deer camps, not on a battlefield. The armourer had looked at it and smirked. "You planning on shooting deer or Germans, Lieutenant?" "Neither," George had replied. "Japanese." But the war had not waited for his rifle. The regiment shipped out before the Winchester reached him. While other officers scrubbed their Garands on the way to Guadalcanal, George's rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois, covered in cosmoline and dust. He begged to have it forwarded through military channels. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally dumped a crate marked fragile at his feet. Inside was the rifle he had sacrificed so much to buy. 9 pounds of steel and walnut, plus 12 ounces of glass and metal in the scope. Every other man in his battalion carried a Garand, about 9.5 pounds, 8 rounds, semi-automatic, no magnification. George's rifle carried only 5 rounds at a time. It had to be cycled by hand after every shot. On paper, it was the wrong weapon for modern war. Captain Morris told him exactly that. "Leave the sporting rifle in your tent, Lieutenant. Take a real gun." George nodded politely and carried the Winchester anyway. By the time the 132nd Infantry relieved the exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942, the island had already become a meat grinder. The Marines had seized Henderson Field in August and held it against repeated Japanese attacks, but the high ground, Mount Austin, called the Gifu by the Japanese, still bristled with bunkers and dug-in defenders. 500 men, 47 fortified positions, jungle so thick it swallowed whole companies. George's battalion joined the assault on December 17th. For 16 days, they crawled up muddy slopes and charged bunkers at grenade range. They lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded, before finally wresting the western slope from the Japanese on January 2nd. Through all of that, the shiny Winchester Model 70 rode on George S. shoulder and never fired a single shot in anger. The real nightmare wasn't the bunkers on the hill, it was what waited beyond. West of Henderson Field, around Point Cruz, the jungle changed character. There were no fixed fortifications, no obvious front line, just towering trees, banyans with trunks 8 feet thick and canopies 90 feet above the ground. And in those trees, invisible men with rifles and glass eyes, Japanese snipers with scoped Arasaka rifles, men who knew the jungle like a second skin and could sit in the fork of a tree from dawn until dusk without making a sound. On January 19th, one of them put a bullet into Corporal Davis while he knelt at a creek refilling canteens. On the 20th, 2 men from L Company died on patrol, dropped from nowhere. On the 21st, another 3 were killed. One of them was shot clean through the neck from a tree the patrol had already walked past twice. By sunset, the battalion commander had had enough. He sent for the lieutenant with the toy rifle. George stepped into the command tent smelling of mud and sweat. Outside, the jungle crackled with unseen life. Inside, a single lantern cast yellow light across a map, stained with fingerprints and rain. The commander didn't bother with pleasantries. "Lieutenant, my men are dying faster from snipers than from malaria. They tell me you have a rifle you think can fix that." George didn't talk about how much he had sacrificed to buy the Winchester, or how many jokes he had endured. He talked about facts. Illinois State Rifle Championship, 1939, 1,000-yard competition. Youngest winner in state history at 23. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, 5 shots in 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander listened in silence, then pointed at the door. "You have until morning to prove that rifle can do more than look pretty. If it can tee, it stays in the tent." "Understood?" George nodded. He did not sleep that night. He stripped the rifle and wiped away the cosmoline still clinging in hidden seams from the ocean voyage. He checked every screw on the scope mount. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had brought from Tennessee. The same cartridge the Garand fired in a different load. And when the first light began to seep into the jungle, he walked alone to a ruined Japanese bunker, overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. No spotter, no radio man, just a rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. The Lyman scope only magnified the world 2.5 times. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The jungle never really goes quiet. Even on Guadalcanal there were always insects buzzing like static, birds calling, distant artillery rolling like a storm just over the horizon. George had learned to ignore that. He focused on one thing, movement. He scanned slowly, so slowly it would have looked like he wasn't moving at all, left to right, top to bottom, tree by tree. At 9:17 a.m., something interrupted the pattern. A branch moved. There was no breeze, no leaves rustled elsewhere, just a small, unnatural shift 87 feet above the ground, in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George waited. The branch moved again. Now he saw it, the curve of a shoulder, the line of a helmet, the dark mass of a man sitting in the crotch where 3 heavy limbs joined. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the supply trail that George's battalion used like a lifeline. George made a small adjustment, 2 clicks to the right for wind. He steadied his breathing, The trigger on the Winchester broke at a crisp 3.5 pounds, smooth as glass. He had tuned it himself at Camp Perry, long before the war turned target rifles into tools for killing. He exhaled, held at the bottom of his breath, and pressed. The rifle kicked into his shoulder, and the report cracked through the trees. 240 yards away, the sniper spasmed and dropped. His body pinwheeled through branches, tumbling almost 90 feet before slamming into the ground near the base of the banyan. George worked the bolt. The empty brass spun into the bunker wall. A fresh round slid into the chamber with a metallic click. He did not look at the body. He looked at the tree. Japanese snipers didn't work alone. If he had just killed the shooter, the spotter was either in the same tree or in one of the others nearby. He began again. Slow, patient, tree by tree. At 9:43 he found the second man in a different tree, 60 yards north of the first. Lower down, maybe 50 feet off the ground, clinging to the trunk and sliding downward, retreating. He had heard the shot. He knew someone was hunting him. George led the movement slightly and fired. The second sniper pitched backwards out of the tree. His rifle clattered on branches ahead of him. Two bodies hit the jungle floor almost together. 2 shots, 2 kills. By noon, the count would rise to 5. Word started to move through the battalion like electricity. The toy rifle was drawing blood. The next morning began in a wall of water. Heavy tropical rain turned the jungle into a blur. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. George sat in his ruined bunker, watching sheets of water run down the barrel of a rifle, and waited. At 08:15 the rain faded to a steady hiss. By 08:45 he could see far enough to work. The first sniper of the day was smart. He had climbed into position during the storm. Rain masked sound, hid movement. He had picked a tree 290 yards away, farther than George had shot the day before. They were adapting. George calculated the extra drop in his head, added a touch for wind, and fired. The 6th sniper died before he knew anyone had found him. The answer came not from a rifle, but from the sky. At 09:57 the first Japanese mortar shells began to fall around the bunker. They had triangulated his rough position from the direction of his shots. The first rounds were short by about 40 yards. The second salvo came in 20 yards closer. The third would be on target. George bolted. He sprinted north along the tree line, the uneven ground sucking at his boots. When he dove into a shell crater and hugged the mud, the third salvo landed where he had been. The bunker simply ceased to exist under a column of dirt and smoke. He moved again. A fallen tree about 120 yards north offered a new perch and a clean view of the groves. He settled behind it, heart still pounding, and brought the scope back to his eye. They knew he was there now. He knew they knew. It was no longer sharpshooting. It was a duel. By the end of the day, he had killed 2 more snipers, numbers 7 and 8. One of them had climbed 94 feet into a banyan, a great hiding place until the sun moved and his outline cut itself clean against the bright sky. George had spent 9 hours on position. When he reported back to Captain Morris at 17, he had 8 confirmed dead, 12 shots fired, 4 misses. No one was laughing at the mail-order rifle anymore. That night, alone in his tent, George did what good shooters always do. He did the math. The intelligence estimate was 11 snipers in the Point Cruz groves. He had accounted for 8. 3 remained. Those 3 were still alive for a reason. They had seen their comrades die. They had watched the patterns. They knew roughly where George worked from, what rifle he carried, and that if they made a mistake, they would never see the shot that killed them. He lay awake with the Winchester across his lap until 3 in the morning. At 4:15 the rain began again. By 5:30 it was too heavy to justify going back to the old positions, so he didn't he. Instead he moved to a new site, a cluster of rocks about 70 yards south of his prior line, used by Marines as a machine gun nest weeks earlier. From there he could see into the same groves, just from a different angle. He let the rain cover his approach, settled in behind stone, and waited. At 07:43, the downpour eased to a drizzle. The jungle emerged again from the grey. George lifted the rifle and began to search. At 8:17 he spotted sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier had chosen a palm tree, about 190 yards away, low in the canopy, only about 40 feet off the ground. That was odd. Most snipers preferred height. Height meant better sight lines. This man had chosen the opposite: concealment. The palm fronds formed a natural blind. From the jungle floor, the sniper would be invisible, but George wasn't on the jungle floor. He was on the rocks, slightly elevated. From his angle he could see down into the fronds, a dark shape of shoulders, the tilt of a head. He settled the crosshairs on the man and began to apply pressure to the trigger. Then something cold crawled up his spine. It was too perfect, too clear, too easy. He had been hunting these men for 3 days. They were cautious, disciplined, patient. The survivors would not suddenly start making rookie mistakes, unless they wanted him to see them. George eased his finger off the trigger. If the man in the palm was bait, then the real threat would be somewhere else with a perfect field of fire covering that tree, waiting for the first muzzle flash aimed at their decoy. He started searching again, slowly, deliberately. Every tree within 300 yards. It took 11 minutes. At 08:28 he found the true danger. A banyan tree about 80 yards northwest of the palm, high up, 91 feet. The sniper there was nestled into a fork, wrapped in branches and vines that concealed him from 3 sides. From that perch, he had a clear view of George's old position at the fallen tree, exactly where they expected him to be. He was waiting for George to shoot at the palm, to reveal himself. George had 2 problems. If he shot the real sniper first, the sound would give away his actual location, and the man could move before George could work the bolt and fire again. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the expected spot and start hunting him. So George did something that looked reckless, but was anything but. He aimed back at the decoy in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and dropped out of the tree. Before the echo faded, George swung the rifle to the banyan. The real sniper would react. He'd turn toward the sound of the shot. Any sudden movement would break the camouflage. Even for a moment, George saw it, a small shift in the branches. He didn't wait for a perfect silhouette. He pressed the trigger. The real sniper toppled from his perch, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills, and one very loud announcement of where George was. Within minutes, a Japanese machine gun raked the rocks he had been using as cover. The burst chewed stone exactly where his head had been seconds before. He moved again, this time dropping into a rain-filled shell crater about 100 yards east. The water came up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the rim. trying not to think about what the mud was doing to the action. He now had 10 confirmed dead snipers. By estimate, one remained. The best one. The one who had watched 9 comrades die. The one who was still alive, not because he was lucky, but because he was dangerously good. George scanned the trees again. Nothing. Then, at 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't he in the branches at all. He was on the ground. George caught a flicker of motion low in his peripheral vision, about 60 yards to the south, near the tree line, a shape crawling through undergrowth, ferns, vines, fallen branches. The sniper was using the jungle floor like a camouflage net, moving toward George S.'s last known position at the rocks. He had watched the fight, watched the machine gun responses. He was tracking not where George was now, but where he should have gone. George stayed as still as the dead. The craterous rim blocked his view. To get a clear shot, he would have to rise up, and he would be exposed. The Japanese sniper halted at 9:52, about 40 yards from the rocks, studying them for movement. George waited. At 9:58, the man crawled again. 35 yards, 30, 25. He angled in from the south, the same route George had used to escape earlier under machine gun fire. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks. He climbed into the old machine gun nest and took position facing east, aimed at the drainage ditch where George should have relocated. He was now 38 yards from George S.'s real position, and his back was wide open. George could have shot him center mass without even using the scope, but he didn't. Any man who had survived 10 days of combat in those groves, watched 10 other snipers die, and was still breathing was not the sort of man who would sit half exposed in such an obvious spot for long. It felt wrong. It felt like bait all over again. So George watched the rocks, but broadened his focus, stretching his awareness into the trees and the brush around that position. If the sniper in the rocks was bait, the real threat would be somewhere else with line of sight to anyone who took the shot at him. At 10:06, George found him, a second Japanese soldier about 70 yards northwest, tucked behind a fallen tree. He wasn't moving. He wasn't a shifting position. He was simply watching, rifle trained on the drainage area where George should have been. 2 men, not one. Maybe it was the last sniper with a bodyguard. Maybe it was the final 2 working as a pair. Either way, George knew one thing. With a bolt-action rifle, he could not put both down before at least one of them fired back. He needed them to move. He slid lower into the cold water until only his eyes and the top of his helmet were above the surface. Winchester held upright to keep water out of the barrel, and he waited. At 10:13, the soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes staring at an empty drainage ditch and concluded George had gone farther east. He signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east in a slow, deliberate sweep, parallel to one another, still about 70 yards apart, combing the jungle for their invisible opponent. They passed the crater. Now they were between George and the tree line, backs exposed. George rose quietly out of the water. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped off the stock, ran down his arms, into his sleeves. He aimed at the closer man, formerly in the rocks, now 42 yards away. He fired. The man dropped. George worked the bolt by reflex and swung the rifle to the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, instinctively bringing his rifle toward the sound. George shot first. 11 shots against snipers in 3 days. 11 snipers dead, and then came the voices. He heard them before he saw them, Japanese voices leaking through the jungle, coming from the direction of the tree line, branches breaking, gear clinking, not snipers, infantry, at least 6, maybe more. George slid back into the crater, feeling the mud suck around his legs. He lowered himself until the water touched his chin and held the Winchester upright, barrel out of the muck. The voices reached the first body, 42 yards away, then moved to the second. Tense, urgent conversation in a language he did not understand. At 10:28 the sound shifted and moved again, not back into the trees, toward the crater. They had found the tracks, his boot prints in the mud between the rocks and the water-filled hole. George counted his ammunition, 5 rounds in the rifle, a minimum of 6 enemy soldiers. Bad odds for a bolt action, even in the hands of a champion. He listened to the footsteps close in. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31 a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater and looked straight down into George's eyes. George fired from the water. The man fell backward out of sight. He worked the bolt underwater, muscle memory overriding discomfort, and rose as he chambered the next round. 2 more silhouettes appeared at the rim. He shot the first, cycled, shot the second. 3 rounds left. Shouts erupted. More men moving in. George scrambled out of the crater on the far side, away from the approaching soldiers. He ran about 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Rifle fire tore into the crater and chewed up the dirt where he had been seconds earlier. The Japanese were shooting at movement and noise, not definitive targets. Through the scope he saw 2 men advancing, about 50 yards away, closing in on the crater. He aimed at the lead soldier and fired. The man dropped, the second dove for cover, 2 rounds left. Voices again, this time from multiple directions. They were swinging around from the south and east. He was about to be surrounded. George knew when a fight tilted from dangerous to suicidal. This was one of those moments. He grabbed his rifle and ran north, between trees and under low branches. Vines clawed at his ankles. Twigs snapped against his face. Rounds cracked past him, slapping into trunks and spraying splinters. He ran for about 90 seconds before hurling himself into another shell crater, this one dry. He hugged the side of the hole and listened. The voices were distant now. The Japanese weren't chasing. They had enough trouble collecting their dead. He checked the rifle. Mud smeared along the stock, water still dripping from the barrel. 2 rounds in the magazine. No stripper clips. The extra ammo had been left by the water-filled crater. At 10:47 he started moving again, this time slower, using the terrain and keeping low. He slipped northeast, toward the American lines, through a jungle that suddenly seemed very quiet. At 11:13 he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George gave his name and unit. Moments later he stood in front of Captain Morris again, this time dripping, filthy, and carrying a rifle that had just changed how his battalion viewed both snipers and sporting guns. The report was simple. 11 Japanese snipers killed in 4 days. 12 rounds fired at them, 11 hits, plus a firefight with infantry, 3 more kills, 5 shots, 2 rounds of ammunition remained in his rifle. The Winchester needed cleaning, so did the man who carried it. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were already starting to withdraw from Guadalcanal, but the battalion's opinion of snipers would never be the same. In the days that followed, the story moved up the chain. By January 27th, George was no longer just the odd man with the unofficial rifle. He became something else, the architect of a new sniper section. Division headquarters had 14 Springfield rifles, with inertial scopes left behind by the Marines. The regiment had 40 men who had qualified as expert riflemen before deployment. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, posed a simple question. "Lieutenant, can you teach them to do what you just did?" George's answer was equally simple. "I can try, but I'll need time, good glass, and men who can already shoot." Ferry gave him all three. On a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field, George lined up his 40 candidates. On paper, they were experts. In reality, none of them had ever killed a man from concealment. He started from zero, breathing control, trigger manipulation, reading mirage and wind, using bone support instead of muscle, building stable positions out of whatever the terrain offered: rocks, logs, sandbags, tree roots. The Springfields weighed about 11 pounds with the inertial scopes, heavier than the Garand, heavier than his Winchester, solid, but tiring to hold on target for long. Range work ran for 3 days. They shot at static silhouettes from 100 to 400 yards, at moving targets, at partial targets hidden by foliage. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under rough field conditions. George split them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter, the spotter carrying binoculars and a Garand for security, swapping roles after each engagement to keep both men sharp. On February 1st, he took 4 teams into real combat. Their mission was to clear out remaining Japanese pockets west of the Matanikau River, scattered infantry covering the larger withdrawal. George and his spotter, Corporal Hayes, set up on high ground above a trail used for resupply. At 07:20, a single Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes confirmed him through binoculars. George fired once. The man fell. Over the next 6 hours, their team engaged 8 targets. 7 died. 1 survived because of a gust of wind. The other 3 teams reported 23 Japanese dead that day and 0 American casualties. Over 12 days, the new sniper section logged 74 confirmed kills. Only count in bodies they could actually see drop. The Japanese pulled out of Guadalcanal by February 9th. When American troops reached Cape Esperance, the defenders were gone. The campaign was over. George didn't leave unscathed. On February 7th, near the Tanamba River, a Japanese rifleman put a bullet through his left shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. Hayes dragged him out of the line of fire and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet passed through muscle, missing bone and major vessels. George spent 2 weeks in a field hospital near Henderson Field. While he healed, the army decided it had another job for him, a classified mission in Burma. Long-range jungle operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of mission where a man who could make first-round hits at 600 yards in bad conditions might come in handy. By March 1943, he was on a troop ship heading across the Pacific again, Winchester packed in a waterproof case, the Lyman scope wrapped in oilcloth. In India, he and about 200 other officers got the full briefing. They were joining a brand new unit of around 3,000 men, with no formal name yet, but soon the world would know them as Merrill S. Marauders, the 5307th Composite Unit, provisional, modelled after British Chindits. They trained in long-range penetration, jungle survival, and operating without supply lines for weeks at a time. George was assigned as a rifle platoon leader in the 2nd Battalion. Officially, no one called him a sniper. The army still didn't really have sniper slots in its table of organization. Unofficially, his reputation had arrived before he did. He adjusted his gear. Burma would not be Guadalcanal. There he had operated close to supply. Here, he would be marching hundreds of miles through mountains and jungle, carrying everything he needed on his back. Every ounce mattered. He replaced a heavier Lyman with a lighter Weaver 330 scope, same 2.5 times magnification, 8 ounces less. He swapped the wooden stock for a lighter synthetic version. The rifle dropped from about 9 pounds 12 ounces to just under 9 pounds. It didn't sound like much. But over a 2-week patrol with 60 pounds of total kit, every ounce turned into pain. In February 1944, the marauders entered Burma with a clear goal: to push through northern Burma on foot, travel over 700 miles of brutal terrain with no roads and limited trails, fording rivers and climbing steep jungle-covered slopes, and capture the Myitkyina airfield, critical for supply flights into China. The Japanese had about 4,000 troops in the area and believed the terrain itself would do most of the killing. They weren't entirely wrong. The first week alone saw 83 miles covered. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases mounted daily. Pack mules broke legs and had to be shot on steep slopes. By March, the marauders had marched over 200 miles and engaged Japanese forces a dozen times. Small ambushes, quick firefights, then fading back into the jungle. They weren't there to hold ground. They were there to raid, disrupt, and keep the enemy perpetually off balance. George used his Winchester exactly 3 times on the march. Once at around 412 yards to drop a Japanese officer directing men at a river crossing. Once at about 380 yards against a machine gun team. Once at about 290 yards to kill a sniper pinning down one of their patrols. 3 shots, 3 kills, never more than 1 round from the same place. The explosive crack of the Winchester stood out from the sharper bark of the Garands. 1 shot was a message. A second shot from the same spot would have been an invitation to counter fire. He learned to shoot, move, and vanish. By late May, the unit had covered over 700 miles. Disease took more men than bullets, malaria, dysentery, typhus. The force that started with around 5,300 men was down to fewer than 3,000 effective. On May 17, 1944, they captured Myitkyina airfield. The mission was a success. The unit, however, was spent, combat ineffective, bones and nerves shredded by months of jungle warfare. George had survived, so had the Winchester, but unlike Guadalcanal, the sniper rifle had barely spoken. Most fights in Burma weren't about long shots across open ground. They were ambushes at 50 yards or less, gunfights where you couldn't see more than 30 feet through foliage. In that kind of war, a bolt action with a scope was more of a specialist-esque luxury than a daily tool. George realized something he wouldn't forget. The Winchester Model 70 was one of the finest sporting rifles ever built, but modern war was shifting toward semi-automatic firepower and standardized weapons. The next big conflict would belong more to weapons like the Garand than to elegant, hand-tuned bolts. By June, the marauders were pulled out and disbanded. George was sent back to the United States, reassigned to training duties. He would never fire the Winchester in combat again. Back in the United States, the Army promoted him to captain and gave him a new home at Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was to teach marksmanship and small unit tactics, to pass on everything the jungle had etched into his bones. He taught officers how to move like ghosts through dense vegetation, how to find and engage targets at distance, how to operate when supply lines were weeks away, not minutes. The Winchester Model 70 came with him. It had travelled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and now to Georgia. By then, it had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in documented engagements, probably more if you counted every jungle fight. Now it spent most of its time in a footlocker. The war moved on without it. American forces fought across France and into Germany. Island hopping continued in the Pacific. The US military leaned into mass production, interchangeable parts, and standard-issue equipment. The age of the lone marksman with a personalized weapon looked like it was ending. George understood why. Modern war demanded industry, not individuality. But he also knew what was lost: the craftsman approach to soldiering, the belief that one man with the right tool and the right training could change the course of a battle. In January 1947, with the rank of lieutenant colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a combat infantry badge, John George left the army. He went back to school. On the GI Bill, he enrolled at Princeton University, studied politics, and graduated with highest honours in 1950. Then came 4 years at Oxford and another 4 in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C. He became executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, then a consultant and lecturer on African affairs at the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute. Most colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. Almost none of them knew about Point Cruz, or the 11 snipers, or the battered sporting rifle that lay in a case in his home. In 1947, George made a decision. He sat down to write what had happened, not as a war memoir full of glory, but as a technical record: what weapons worked, what tactics didn't, how jungle warfare really felt to someone behind a rifle. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript passed 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association reels and carefully engineered rifles. Lessons he had learned the hard way, alone in a muddy crater on Guadalcanal, were refined, systematized, and taught to new generations. John George died on January 3rd, 2009, at 90 YD IT, and pushed for publication. George hesitated. It was dense, filled with detailed descriptions of rifles, ammunition, ballistics, and equipment performance in mud, rain, and fear. It hardly sounded like a book the average peacetime reader would pick up for fun. But the NRA persisted. That year, the book came out under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It quietly became a classic among gun enthusiasts, World War II historians, and collectors trying to understand how Japanese and American small arms really compared in the field. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons remain some of the most detailed first-hand accounts we still have. He lived long enough to watch the Korean War, the long bleed of Vietnam, and the short, sharp Gulf War. He watched as the Garand gave way to the M14, the M14 to the M16, and sniping evolved from an improvised role to a formal specialty with dedicated shears old. His Winchester Model 70 did not die with him. It went to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today it sits in a glass case with a small placard explaining what it once did. Most visitors walk past without stopping. To them, it is just another old hunting rifle, but it is not. It is the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a so-called mail-order scope could outshoot professional military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves of a deadly threat in 4 days, when a whole battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that nudged the American army toward taking individual marksmanship seriously in modern war. If this story moved you, do what you can to keep it from disappearing into silence.